Hello everyone. Today I'm going to be presenting to you how to build your first full stack app with Flask. My name is Jeremy Borne. This is a talk that I've given many times at various different hackathons and other events, and today I'm just recording a copy of this presentation so that if you're at a hackathon or event or something and you happen to see my presentation live or you happen to miss it and you want to come back and take a look at it, then you can do so. Just note, at any point you can take a look at the sample code, slides, and some helpful resources at this GitHub link here. So without further ado, a little bit about myself. So my name, of course, is Jeremy Borne. I currently work as a full stack software developer at Ascent. I co-founded the WinHacks and Border Hacks hackathons in 2020, so I helped organize these hackathons at the University of Windsor. Hackathons have been in my blood for quite a while now. I've also worked at the University of Windsor as a research assistant and teaching assistant, and I was the president of the University of Windsor's Computer Science Society for a couple of years. So definitely had the opportunity to teach things like this a few different times. And also, I am a former project lead for the Google Developer Student Club at the University of Windsor. Uh, I love hackathons. I've participated in many hackathons. I've been a mentor for many hackathons, a speaker, as well as an organizer for various hackathons. So I've definitely had my fair share of hackathon experiences. Below you can see a link to my website, to my GitHub, and my LinkedIn. I encourage you all to connect with me on LinkedIn. If you see an area I can improve in this presentation, then feel free to make a pull request or an issue. Uh, and yeah, so a little bit of housekeeping and agenda of what I'm going to be going over today. So I'm going to go through some slides and give an introduction to Flask. What exactly is Flask? Why you should probably consider using it, how to install it, create your first simple app, and then go over some things like routes and templates, and then how to extend your Flask application with other third-party libraries. And then after I get through the slides, I'll be going through an interactive demo. So what exactly is Flask and why should you use it? So Flask is what we call a micro web framework that's written in Python. So Flask is made for coding the back end of websites. So basically what this is you can create an API that returns JSON for something like a React application that displays the front end, or you can have your Flask application create HTML that the user actually just goes and sees. That's what we're going to be doing for this, but it's very simple to use Flask to build a backend for another traditional single page application using something like Svelte or React. Um, but, for hackathons, for simple projects, I often find that it makes the most sense to just have something like Flask return HTML. And then if you need any extra interactivity on the website, oftentimes using JavaScript for that is the best option. So I call it a micro web framework because it's very light by design. It doesn't have a ton out of the box that you can do with it, and that's actually a good thing because Flask is very unopinionated. It doesn't tell you exactly how you have to do stuff. It just gives you a very solid foundation, some very simple tools to, create this back end uh, of your website, and then you have many additional third-party libraries that help extend it so that you can do additional things. So we're going to talk a little bit more about those later, but I've listed a few here. WT Forms, which is used for form validation and stuff like that. SQL Alchemy, which is used for handling the database side of things, which we're actually going to be using in our demo, and then Flask Login, which makes handling logins and user management, stuff like that, it makes that a whole lot easier. So if you happen to be using user authentication on your website, Flask Login is actually a really good option for that. So I think I've kind of already gone over this a little bit, but so why exactly should you use Flask? Well, it's very simple. Like I said, it's very lightweight. So because of that, it's very easy to get started. Um, if you're building something more complicated, there are a ton of great add-ons and third-party libraries that are made specifically to tie into Flask. So it's going to make your development experience much, much easier. It's extremely hackathon friendly. You know, I've made so many different Flask applications for different hackathon events, and it's helped me win certain prizes and whatnot in previous years. So I definitely recommend it for hackathons. Um, it also scales very well, right? So because Flask is so small, if you're making a very, very simple, tiny website, then it works very well for that. But again, like I said, if you're making something much more complicated and you need to scale your project more in terms of complexity, it works really, really well because you have all these great third party libraries made specifically to extend Flask. Uh, it's really a good option for pretty much any type of web application, whether it's simple or whether it's more complex. If you're dealing with something that has a lot of user interactivity, you may want to pull in a front end library or framework to handle that side of things. But for what we're going to be doing today, just using Flask to serve up some HTML is going to work really well. And the other thing I really like about Flask is it's very customizable, right? So if you go to, more of these bigger frameworks like Next.js or like Ruby on Rails or things like Django, they tend to be very opinionated. And, if you want to do things, you usually have to kind of do it the way they want you to do it. And Flask is not like that, right? It's very small and you have a lot of options for how you want to implement things. If you have a specific way you want to implement something, there's nothing stopping you from doing that. So, how do you install it? How do you use Flask? Very simply, as long as you have a modern version of Python, you can just pip install Flask and start using it. So, if you're, not an experienced Python developer, you may not know about things like venv or virtual environments. I definitely recommend doing a little bit of research into things like that because it makes handling, pulling in different libraries and installing them a lot easier. Poetry is another really great tool for handling libraries in Python for projects like these. Of course, today I'm not going to be getting into that, but it's something to consider. So, as long as you have a modern version of Python, doesn't matter if you're on Windows, Linux, Mac OS, you can simply pip install Flask and get right to work. So, how do we start our first Flask app? So, as you can see here, I said it's very simple. I think we've got about 7 lines of code here. So, we create a file, call it something like app.py typically. The first line, we are importing Flask. We're creating an instance of our Flask app, and then we're creating this route, right? So you can see this slash here. That means we're going to run the web application, right? And then when you hit the slash endpoint, so the normal endpoint for like a home page or whatnot, we're going to return this text, hello world. And then the last 2 lines just say to Python, if we're running the file, then let's run the Flask app. And when you run Python or Python 3 app.py, how you would normally run a Python application. It's going to give you some nice logs and whatnot. And then if you go to localhost port 5000, you'll be able to see the hello world message come up. So how do we typically structure a Flask app? So what I've given here is a pretty simple example. You know, if you can fit everything you want into one app.py, then this tends to work pretty well. So you've got your app.py, which has got all your backend logic in it. Then typically you'll have a config.json or a .env file, which is going to have all your secrets, database credentials, API keys, stuff like that. Then you'll often have a static folder, which is going to have your styles, any things like JavaScript. You might be pulling in Alpine JS or Bootstrap or HTMX, something like that you may want to use. You'll typically put all this in your static folder. And then lastly, we typically have a templates folder, which is going to have Jinja 2 templates, which end up getting rendered into uh, custom HTML, which we'll show a little bit more. So how do routes and templates work, right? This is kind of the bread and butter for how we're going to be working with Flask. So very quickly, we'll go over some common functions that you'll need to know uh, when you're using Flask. So we use the render template function to render an HTML template in the templates folder. So if we go back, we may have this home.html page. We would pass that into render template to actually get the HTML of the page. We've got URL4, which is going to allow us to basically get a very safe URL for a specific endpoint as opposed to guessing like /about/ whatever. We can use URL4 and it'll generate that URL for us. And we use that in links and redirecting and whatnot. And then here we have redirect, which is like you may want to submit a form and then redirect them home. Or maybe if they log out, you redirect them to a login page or something like that, right? So how do we create routes? So I showed you before that slash route where we just returned the hello world. And here you can see we have an about page and it's going to render this about.html. Contact page renders contact.html. Very simple. So how do we make dynamic routes, right? So imagine you've got something like a blog, right? And you have different blog posts, and you may want to do /posts/1, /post/2, etc., something like that. So in this case, we can actually grab the post ID from the URL. So you can see here, we grab the post ID, we might do something with it, grab it from the database, something like that, and then render a template based on that. In this case, we say about.html, when in reality it should probably be like post.html or something else, but that doesn't really matter. How do we use URL4, which I mentioned before? So in our template, so this is an HTML anchor tag, right? We take the href and we pass in this URL4, so posts, because this method here is called posts, and we pass in the post ID of 4, so that would go in here. And what this will do is generate a nice URL for us, and it'll point to /posts/4. So that's how we might use it in a link. And I'll show you more about that when we do the interactive demo. So how do templates and inheritance work? So one of the cool things about Flask is we can use inheritance in our templates to make sure we don't have to repeat common elements. So here, oftentimes we have some sort of a layout.html which contains all our boring, styles, imports, setting the title. We might have a nav bar in there, and then we might have a home page, about page, contact page, things like that. So here we've got the skeleton of our HTML in layout.html, and then we use this special Jinja2 syntax to say, okay, we may want to slot something into this content block. And then in home.html, let's say we want to use this skeleton and just pass in a hello world. We do it like so. We say we're going to extend the layout.html template, and then we say, okay, here's the content block, and we're going to pass in this hello world, and then this h1 gets passed into here. And you'll see how that works when we do the interactive demo. So more on templates, you can pass in something like a contacts array into your template or whatever you want. And so you can loop through it. So for contact and contacts, imagine you've got a list of 5 different names. This will actually render out all 5 names so it'll be a list of 5 H3s with their name in there. And then you can also use an if statement in your HTML. So very often, in something like the Flask login library, we have this current user object. So if the current user is authenticated, then we'll say welcome user. Otherwise, we'll say you must log in. So that's something you can do. So what are some next steps? What are some options you have for extending? So there are a bunch of common packages that you often use when making a full stack app in Flask. Flask SQL Alchemy is one we'll be using today. So that's going to allow you to connect to different SQL databases, and it makes working with them very easy. Flask login, like I mentioned earlier, is very nice for handling user sessions, authentication, authorization, stuff like that. Makes it a breeze. Gunicorn is one that you might use with a reverse proxy like Caddy, which is going to allow you to deploy the application. And there are other options you can use for deployment, which is beyond the scope of this. And then there's a couple others. Flask uploads makes handling file uploads easier and more secure. Bcrypt, if you're doing any sort of user authentication with passwords, you're probably going to be looking at that one. So, without further ado, let's get into the interactive demo. So, what exactly will we be building today? We're going to be building a pretty simple shopping list application. So you can see we have a home page, we have an add page, and we have a view page. So let's go to this add page, and let's say we want apples, and let's say we want pears, and oranges. We can now go to view items, and you'll be able to actually see all the different items we just put in. Additionally, we'll be able to update or delete them. So I'll hit update, and let's say we actually wanted applesauce instead. You can notice that we've actually updated it. And then additionally, you can delete items. So you can see I can go home, I can go to view, and here we are. So this is what we're going to be making. It may not look like much, but what we have here is create, read, update, and delete functionality, which is, we call that CRUD. And that actually gives you the foundations to make a ton of different things, right? So if you take the principles learned in creating something like this and extend it, you'd be surprised how much you can actually create. So without further ado, let's get started. So here I am on my desktop. I'm just going to create a new folder, and I'll just call it Flask app or something similar, right? I'm going to now open it with VS Code. And I'll pull this over now. And so you'll see we've got just an empty Visual Studio Code. The first thing we're going to want to do is create an app.py. And in this app.py, we're going to have all of our fun backend code. And even before we do that, let's make sure we have Flask and everything we need installed. So I've got my terminal open, and you can do terminal, new terminal, or you can do view terminal, or you can do the control plus tilde, which is how I tend to open it. And we can just do pip install Flask, and we also want Flask underscore SQL alchemy. And you'll notice that we already have it installed, which is perfect. So let's create our first Flask app. So we're going to say from Flask import Flask. And this is going to be just, the bare bones project. We're going to create an instance of the Flask object, and this is going to be our Flask app. We're going to do app.get slash for our home page, def index, return hello world. So this is going to be a hello world message that shows up. And then we can do this. If name equals main, app.run. So I can save this, and then I can just run py, app.py, and you'll notice we get all this fun messaging, and we also see that we're running on port 5000. So let's look, and you'll see hello world appears on the page. Perfect. So where do we go from here? Well, first thing, we probably want to return some HTML. So the first thing we're going to do is create a templates folder, and we're going to create a home.html. All right. So let's do this home, or we can do shopping list application. All right. Perfect. Now let's go back to our app.py, and we're going to import render template, and rather than just returning hello world, we're actually going to render our home.html page. So save it, and you'll notice when I saved it, we detected the change here, and it'll actually reload the app for us without having to worry about anything. So if I go here and I refresh my page, you'll see we have shopping list application. Now, this is fun and all, but what if we also have an about page and an add page and a view page and all that fun stuff? We don't want to have to repeat all this stuff everywhere, right? So, as I mentioned earlier in the slides, we're going to create a layout.html. Let's copy everything here, and what we're going to do is this right here. So we're going to create a block content, end block, and that looks good. In our home.html, we're going to say extends layout.html, and then we are going to slot in this stuff into the content block. So you'll notice now we're going to get all this stuff in here when we render our home.html. So let's refresh, and you'll see home. This is the home page. Perfect. Now, something I'm going to do real quick now is import some styles. So I'm going to create a static/style.css, and I'm just going to copy it from the sample code. Feel free to do the same. Nothing too crazy. And then what I'm going to do is add it in here. So link CSS. And in the href, what I'm going to do is do this. URL for static file name equals style.css. So what this is going to say is we're going to look in the static folder, right? This is what this static endpoint is. And we're going to grab style.css, which is this here. All right, let's save. And when we refresh the page, you'll notice the background changed and some of this other stuff changed, which is perfect. What I'm also going to do now is just make a little change to our layout.html. So I'm going to put a content block in a container, which is just going to push things in based on the CSS that I created. And I'm also going to create a very simple nav bar. So I'm going to create a nav and then a UL, LI with an A. And I'm going to do this right here. Home. So we have URL for, in this case it says index, but we actually, oh, it is index. Okay. So we've got URL for index and it is called home. So let's save that. And you'll notice no matter what page we're on, this nav bar is still going to show up because it's in our layout.html. So let's refresh, and then there you can see our nav bar with our home, and when I click it, we go back home. Very nice. So, where do we go from here? Well, the next thing we probably want is to have our database set up, right? So, what we can do now, go back to our app.py. From Flask SQL Alchemy, we're going to import SQL Alchemy. And we are going to do this. So we're going to say, we're going to configure our app and say, where is our SQL Alchemy database? SQLite // data.db basically just means we're going to create a SQLite database and it's going to be in this data.db file. Next, we're going to create this db variable here, and this is going to be how we interact with our database. After that, what we want to do is create our shopping list item, right? So we're going to do class item db.model. So this is going to give it some properties that allows us to use it with the database. So we're going to do id equals db.column, db.integer, primary key equals true. So this is going to be the main primary identifier for the item. And then we're going to say we can give this item a name, and this is just going to be a string. And we're going to say, in this it says it should be a unique. We don't really care about that right now. And nullable equals false. This means we don't want the user to be able to create an item without a name. So this is all great. We've got our database and we've got the table we actually want, the stuff we want to be able to save. The last thing we need is for it to actually create this data.db database, right? And what we're actually going to do here is add a little bit of helper code that's going to check to see if the database exists. So it's going to check if the file exists. And if not, we're going to create the database. So if not os.path.exists, and this is actually going to be instance/data.db because that's just how they store it with Flask SQL Alchemy. We're going to do with app.app_context db.createAll. So these 3 lines basically just say if the database doesn't exist already, then we're going to create it, right? So we save here, and you'll notice if I actually stop my Flask app and delete this folder, if I run it again, it will create this instance/data.db. So this is our SQLite database in here. All right, pretty good. And let's go back now, refresh. Everything seems to be working. Perfect. So what do we do now, right? We've got our database set up. We've got our homepage set up. The first thing we probably want to do is give the user the ability to create items in the database, right? So why don't we make another template for that? And I'm just going to copy the home page and call it add.html, right? So we're going to change this to add item to shopping list, and then I'm going to create a form. So form method equals post, and this looks all good. So we're going to have a label, and actually we don't even need a label. We can just have an input, which is text. So this is where you're going to input the item, and we're going to give it a name equal to name. And this is just how we access the data later on, which I'll show you. And then we're going to have a submit button, which I'm going to change it a little bit to be like this. And that should be all good. Right, now we have to actually make it so the user can go here, right? So we're going to do app.get/add, and then we're going to make a new route. We're going to call it add page, and we're going to render the template add.html, right? The last thing we're going to do is we're just going to add a section to our navbar. So if all went well, we should be able to refresh. And so we actually got a little bit of an error, which is okay. Probably because I didn't save this app.py. So you should see it ran again. And if I refresh, you can see home. And if we go to add item, then you'll see we're in the /add endpoint and we've got a form. So let's write something in and hit submit. Oh no, it says method not allowed. What does this mean? This just means we've created the page for it, but we haven't told Flask what to do when the user creates an item, right? So let's go back, add item, and we're going to go back to our app.py, and we're going to say, okay, what happens when the user tries to submit this form? So if you remember, we created a post form, right? And it's on the /add endpoint, which is here. So we make an app.post/add. So we say add item. Now we need to get the actual content of the of the form. So first thing we're going to do is fix our import here so we get this request object. Now we can get from the form the name field, which is the field here. This is this input field. And now we can actually create a new item. So we say item equals item, name equals name. So we created this instance of our item class. And now we have to actually add the item to our database. So we do that by db.session.add_item and then db.session.commit. So this is adding the item to our database, and then this commit is basically saving the changes to our database. And then lastly, we just want to render the add.html page. Or what we can do is redirect the user somewhere else, but in this case, this should work just fine. So if we do apples, and we can do pears. Now you'll notice we have no way of actually seeing what's in the database, right? So let's create another one. First thing, let's copy our home page, and we'll call it view. And we're going to say view items, and we're going to go back to our layout, and we're going to add a link. So we're going to do view page, view items, and this is going to fail if we try to go to it because we haven't made that endpoint yet. So let's do that now. And you can see my handy AI assistant is pretty much writing everything for me. So we create a new endpoint /view. We're going to call it view page. We're going to get all the items from our database. So that's what this line here is for. And then we're going to render our view.html, passing in the items. So now, when we go back, well, first I'll save this, and then I'll go back to view.html. And how do we actually want to display them? Well, let's create a table. And we're going to create the first row, which is just going to have the ID. We're going to have the name. And then we're going to have another row, which is for actions. So if you remember, we had like update, delete, stuff like that. So we've got that. And then what we're going to do is iterate through all of the items and create, a row for each. So this all looks good. So we're going to make a new row. We're going to add the item.id and item.name. And then for this, because we don't have this endpoint yet, I'm actually just going to do a hash here. So we're going to have update and delete, but these aren't going to work yet. So that should all work. So let's go back to our Chrome. Go back home and let's go to view items. So if you remember, we had the apples and pears, I believe. When we click on this, it should work. And you'll see view items, ID1 apples, ID2 pears, update and delete. When we click on them, they're not going to do anything yet. That's because we haven't told Flask what to do when we click these yet, right? So let's actually do delete first because delete is probably the easier one. So we're going to go back to our app.py. We're going to create a new endpoint for deleting the items. So we're going to do app.get/delete/int ID. So this is going to say when we hit /delete/1, it's going to delete the item with ID of 1. So it's going to delete apples, right? So delete item ID. First thing we're going to want to do is actually query the item from our database. So we're going to get the item from our database, and if this ID doesn't exist, then we're just going to return a 404 error. Next thing we want to do, db.session.delete. So you saw we did db.session.add to add an item. It's pretty simply db.session.delete to delete one, and then db.session.commit to save our changes. So we we click this link. It says, okay, we're going to delete ID1. We delete it from our database, and then what do we want to do? Let's just go back to the view page. So let's go back home, and actually, I'm going to go back to view, and I'm going to update this delete endpoint. So we're going to do URL4 delete item, and we're going to pass in the ID equal to item.id. And let's just make sure that's right. Looks right to me. So let's save this and go back to our Flask app. So let's refresh, and when we hit delete, you'll notice that we rendered the page, and I think I made a little bit of a boo-boo here. So I said render template view.html. That's not actually what we want to do. What we actually want to do is just go back to the view page, right? So what we're going to do is import the redirect from Flask, and as opposed to just rendering this template, because you notice we didn't pass in the items like we were supposed to, we want to return redirect, and we're going to pass in URL for view page. And my AI is going a little bit hectic right now, but you can see that. And I'm just going to update my import from Flask, and everything should be working good. So let's refresh, and let's go back to add. So let's add apples, oranges, and go back to view. So we've got pears, apples, oranges. Let's hit delete. And you'll notice we deleted it, and then we redirected back to view. So we'll hit delete again, and you should see oranges go away. Beautiful. All right, so we can go back now. The last thing we want to do is have this update page, right? So let's copy the add.html this time, and we're going to call it update.html, and we're going to say update item in shopping list. And it's all pretty much going to be the same, except what we're going to do is actually pass in the value of the existing item, right? So the way we do that in HTML is we set the value property. So we say the value is equal to item.name, right? When we pass in our item, we want this value here to be its name. All right, so we can save that and then go to our app.py, and actually before that, or no, let's do it here first. We'll do an app.get, and as you can see, AI here already knows what we're doing. So we've got /update/ID, because of course we're going to need the ID to update a specific item. We're going to get the item from the database, and then we're going to return this template update.html with the specific item in mind, right? So let's save our app.py, and then let's go to our view.html, and we're going to take that suggestion there. So update item, ID equals item.id, and hit save. And now let's go home, let's go view, let's hit update on apples, and you'll see we're back at the page that we're expecting. So again, let's go to applesauce, let's hit submit, and again, you see method not allowed, right? Because we haven't told Flask what to do when we actually submit that form. So, very simply, let's go back to our app.py, and we will create an app.post, and this is one of the great things about Flask is it's so simple that a lot of times these AI autocompletes can just let you breeze right through it. So we're going to do update ID, update item post. So we're going to grab the item. We're going to now set the item.name to equal the new name, right, from this form. And then we're just going to save our changes. So we've made the update here to the name. Then we're going to save the changes. And then we're going to redirect to the view page. All right. So let's refresh. Go back to view. Go back to update, change this to applesauce, submit, and there you go. And that's about it. So as you can see, very quickly, very simply, we were able to make a full stack Flask app where we've connected to a real database. We have the ability to create items, update items, read a list of items, and delete items, right? So we have the basic functionality of any full stack app right here. This can be extended in so many different ways to create so many different great projects. I highly recommend you check out different resources like Flask WTF for handling forms and whatnot, as well as, if you're uploading files, you may want to check out Flask uploads or Flask login if you're going to do user authentication, things like that. There's lots of great options for you. You may be wondering now, though, you've built this application, but maybe you want the application to be a little bit more reactive, or you may want a little bit more user interactivity on it, right? And the way we've been interacting with our Flask app right now is just with links and forms, right? And that's kind of all you can do with HTML right out of the box without bringing anything else in. So there are two really main methods you can use to overcome this and add additional interactivity to the website. So you can pull in JavaScript, and this can be in the form of using a front-end library like React or Vue or Svelte, something like that. Or you can just simply write simple vanilla JavaScript. I highly recommend that, especially if you're a beginner. It's a great way to learn. The other thing you can look at is something like HTMX, which is going to allow you to add additional interactivity to your website without the need of writing much JavaScript, if any JavaScript. So you notice we used forms and links, and it's very simple to interact with the website using that. It's very similar with HTMX. You use different HX attributes. And if you look at my GitHub, this is the GitHub for the Flask workshop with all the sample code and stuff like that. I also have another one for an HTMX workshop that I did at Hack the North 2024. So if you want to check that out, in this workshop, I actually created a full stack app with Flask on the back end and HTMX as a front end library to add extra interactivity. I think this is a really cool option that you can check out. But since we have time today, I think I'm just going to show you really quickly how you may want to use Flask with something like a React application on the front end or like a JavaScript application on the front end, right? So the way we typically do this is we have our Flask application just return data, and then we let JavaScript handle actually dealing with, what we want to do with this data, right? So what we can do, let's go back to our home.html and let's just make a button and we're going to make it fetch some data and then do something with it. So we're going to make a button and we're going to say, click me to fetch data. And we're going to give this an ID of fetch data. And now what we can do is write some JavaScript. So luckily, AI here is doing most of the work for me. So what we can do is grab this button element. So that's what this document.getElementById thing does. And then we're going to say add event listener. So when we click this button, what do we want to happen? It's going to run this function. It's going to fetch data from the /view endpoint. I'm actually going to change this to we're going to call it view JSON. And this is just going to return the data. So very simply, we're going to have an endpoint. It's going to grab all the items, and then it's going to return an object with the items in it, and it's going to have a list with just all the item names. So at this point, it's going to so it's going to fetch it. We're going to do view JSON instead. It's going to get the response from that and then try to parse it into JSON. And then from there, we're going to console.log it. And what I actually think I'm going to do here is also just add it to the document. And you'll see what this looks like in a bit. So let's go back home. And I don't actually see. Oh, this was the example that I was showing. Let's go back to home here. And we're going to see a button. Click me to fetch data. And it is writing the response here. So you can see we also wrote it out here to the console. And we would, probably do something a little bit more useful in our home.html. Like for example, we could do a pre and something like this, or we'll just do this. Pre ID equals response. And instead of document.write, we're going to do this here, which is just saying we're going to take the response and we're going to throw it in this here, as opposed to what we were doing before, which is just replacing the data. So here you go. And if we go to add item, pears, oranges, and apples, whatever it is, home. So we can click and you'll see here. So again, this isn't a very useful example, but it gives you an idea of what you might want to do on your end when creating an application with Flask, rather than using, this JavaScript like this, maybe you'll pull in something like Alpine JS or HTMX or even React or Vue you can pull in very simply to add some interactivity to your website without, you know, being limited by just using forms and links. So this is an option you can do. Um, I encourage you to just play around with different technologies, check out different options. Flask is a really great technology. It's a really great library for creating things like this. I've had a lot of fun with it throughout the years, and I hope you do too. So, this is a video, so I don't think you can ask any questions right now live, but feel free to leave a comment. And thank you very much for joining. I hope you all learned something new. Uh, as always, remember, check out the uh, GitHub page here for the most up-to-date slides and sample code. There's also a lot of other nice to have things, like it shows you how a .env works, so you can handle environment variables, things like that. We've got a git ignore in there, and we've got, a lot of cool stuff. I also have a Flask template that you can check out. It's got a bunch of other, it's set up with poetry, so it's a little bit nicer. If you've got a bit more of a complex project, then you can check out this template to get started with. Another option or another resource you can look into is I wrote a blog article on how to host something like this for free on Google Cloud Platform. So here I'll show you how to create this server, do all this fun stuff so that you can run this Flask application and people can actually go and visit it, right? So I'm of course not going to go through it all right now because I already have a YouTube tutorial out for it and I've got this blog article, but definitely consider checking that out. Uh, and yeah, I hope you learned something new.